Hello. So we're going to move on and continue on with our same topic of the Arab-Israeli wars. We had talked about, did a couple lectures on the birth of Israel, and then we, of course, talked about the, uh, you know, set of conflicts that had began starting from 1948. So we're going to kind of continue on from where we left off last time. As a reminder, where we left off last time was this period of time. First, we had the creation of the State of Israel, and of course, the issue of Gaza and West Bank that we had talked about over here, right? West Bank and Gaza area. And we talked about the first war in 1948, explained how in that first war, the area of the West Bank was conquered by Jordan, the area of Gaza was conquered by Egypt. Israel did expand some of their land. And then we went on to some of the other conflicts, of course, the war against Egypt as well, and then the Six-Day War we spent a little bit of time on, and talked about that conflict where in that war Israel just acquired tremendous amount of land. Remember, conquering all of Egypt, conquering all of the area of Gaza, conquering all of the West Bank, conquering the Golan Heights, that whole region they took over. And so that was a very big accomplishment as a result of the Six-Day War. Then from there, we talked about that conference in Sudan, and we're now at this period of time in the late 1960s, early 1970s of a bit of a stalemate, right? The Israelis control a good chunk of real estate. They control a lot of land that was just under Arab control a few years earlier. And the Arab nations are at a point where, at this point at least, in early 1970s, they refuse to even acknowledge Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. So that's kind of where we are. The Soviet Union is often providing help to the Arab nations. Of course, the United States is providing help to Israel in various ways. What's next? Well, unfortunately, what's next is more tragic and more conflicts before we get to some peace treaties that will emerge as well. So this is a important story. Some of you may be familiar with this, but it was in 1972, so we're just kind of moving along chronologically. And this is, of course, the Munich Massacre. For those of you who are not familiar with this, a little background. It was Olympics, of course. The Olympics were held in 1972, in a stark irony in Munich, Germany. The Israeli delegation, as you see there, was at this event, and the PLO, which I mentioned before, and we'll talk about again in the next lecture in more detail, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, went to the areas where the athletes were staying, and they massacred them. They went in, found these athletes, and killed them all in the 1972 Munich Massacre. And so this, of course, is going to resonate in Israel dramatically. Here are civilians, they're not soldiers, they're athletes, they're in a place that's supposed to be goodwill, and of course, of all places, Germany, where this happened. And so this was an event that the Israelis did not forget. It was an event that clearly is going to make it very hard for Israel to look at the Palestinians who live in Gaza and West Bank and so forth and say, yeah, we want to be peaceful with people who are just about, just murdered 12 or how many, I think, forgot how many, not 10, 11 of their athletes. That's a very important point that had taken place as well. So that was the 1972 Munich Massacre. So you definitely want to be familiar with that event because it will heighten the tensions dramatically between Israel and the Palestinians. All right, we move on. 1973. So 1973, there's going to be another big war called the Yom Kippur War. Here you're actually looking at the Prime Minister of Israel as the Yom Kippur War begins. So I definitely want to talk a little bit about this lady named Golda Meir. And yes, she was the Prime Minister of Israel. So they did have a female Prime Minister fairly early in their history, considering their civilization in terms of the rebirth started in 1948, right? By 1973, they have a female Prime Minister. A few things about Golda Meir, if you've never heard of her before. She was actually born in the Ukraine. She moved to Milwaukee. She spent a lot of time in Milwaukee as a younger woman. And then she moved back to Israel in 1921 during one of the Aliyahs that we had mentioned before. She lives in Israel. She lives in what's called a kibbutz. If you don't know that term, that's okay. But a kibbutz is it's a place where a lot of younger Jewish people go, kind of a work co-op. They live there and on a kibbutz together. They all kind of pull their weight together to make a little village work. And she rose in politics. She became labor minister, foreign minister, and eventually was elected prime minister of Israel. And one of the things she is known for is her very direct quotes about Israel and the Arab nations and the peace issues. And we'll talk about the war, but I want to read to you a few of her quotes because these quotes are very powerful. For some people, they are a little uncomfortable. For other people, they read these quotes and go, yes, I like what she's saying. Other people go, how can you say such a thing? So I'm going to read to you just a few of them. A couple of them make sense. A couple of them, you'll see what I mean as I go through them. So one of the things she says is this: when the Jews, and this is paraphrasing, when the Jews are killed, they are always mourned. When they fight back, they are always the first to be criticized. So if I have to choose between being dead and mourned or alive and criticized, I choose to be alive and criticized. So this is something that she talked about. Like an example of this was in 1960. The Israeli Mossad, the Israeli secret police, captured a man named Adolf Eichmann. And Adolf Eichmann was in Argentina. He was a Nazi individual, and they captured him, and they didn't ask Argentina. They just went and did this unilaterally and so forth, and they were condemned from this by doing this. How dare you go into another country and do this? It's like, well, I mean, you all mourned us when we were being killed. Now that we're fighting back, you're upset. So that's kind of her view of things. Here's another one that she says, and this is a couple of them that are a little bit more intense. She says, we can forgive you, referring to the Arab nations, we can forgive you for killing our children. We cannot forgive you for forcing us to kill your children. And this is the one that really raised a lot of eyebrows. One, she said, there will be peace in the Middle East when the Arabs love their children more than they hate us. And you can imagine if you're an Arab and you're hearing a quote like that, this is going to maybe make you a bit upset, right? You're saying you hate, again, so there'll be peace in the Middle East when the Arabs love their children more than they hate us. And what she's saying is there's such a despise for the Jewish people that the Arabs are willing to send their own children to their death to destroy the Jewish state. Um, the sad thing to say about this is there is an element to this. Now, again, it's always important to remember you never want to generalize and say everybody's the same way. There are countless numbers of Arab people that would never do such a thing. There's countless numbers of Arab people who want peace with Israel and do not want to sacrifice their own children to destroy the state of Israel. But there's an interesting book, if you ever get a chance to pick it up, it's called Son of Hamas. And it's actually about a son of a leader of Hamas. And in this book, he's basically discussing how a lot of the leadership of the Hamas community would literally do that. They would use their children to go and stone Israelis or to go attack Israelis, and he said, this is crazy. What are we doing to ourselves? We should be sending our kids to school. We're getting all these resources. Why are we using them to fight the Jews? Let's build up our community. Let's send our kids to school. And so there were even people from inside the Arab community who looked at this and go, she's got kind of point. So anyways, it's an interesting situation. It's very touchy for a lot of people, as you can imagine. And always I try to just present the ideas to you, and you can research this stuff yourself. But a little bit more if you want. But those are the quotes of Golda Meir. So that's part of who she is. She's very kind of seen as a hard-nosed person, and she is the leader of Israel in 1973. And in 1973, a war breaks out again called the Yom Kippur War, which of course is that very religious holiday in the Jewish calendar. Egypt at the time was led by a man named Sadat. We're going to talk more about him as well. Sadat was a man who in 1973 opposed the state of Israel, was fully on board with fighting this war with Israel, and that was his position in 1973. So in terms of the details of the 1973 war, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, although Jordan was not nearly as heavily involved. In fact, King Hussein of Jordan really didn't want to be part of this at all. He's kind of between a rock and a hard place. All the other Arab nations were involved. And so he even, King Hussein of Jordan, he even tried secret negotiations with Israel for a while because he didn't want him to be known public. So he was actually one of the earliest people in the Arab community. And again, you say Hussein, this is not Hussein of Iraq, this is King Hussein of Jordan, who wanted a more peaceful situation with Israel, but even he got sucked into this war a bit. But it was primarily Egypt, Iraq, and Syria who said, well, we're going to try to go against Israel again. And the goal of this 1973 war is for basically these nations to retake land they lost in the 1967 war. Remember, Egypt had lost the Sinai Peninsula, Jordan had lost the West Bank, Syria had lost the Golan Heights, right? And so like, we're going to try to get this back. So there's this war. The Soviet Union is providing weapons and arms to the Arab nations. Again, the United States is supporting Israel. And this got pretty intense. And it got so intense because there was some discussion that the Soviet Union was going to put military forces in there. That in 1973, there was actually a nuclear alert. Because people thought, well, if the Soviets move forces, the United States moves forces, now you're looking at some crazy stuff going on. And in 1973, something else had developed. Israel, while this is not official, by 1973, we believe Israel has nuclear bombs. Israel's position on nuclear bombs is that we don't acknowledge if we have them or we don't have them. Everybody knows they have them. But if we do have them, they say we're not going to use them unless our entire nation is threatened. In other words, we'll never use nuclear bombs unless we need to protect our nations from an existential annihilation. If, for example, somebody threatens to drop a nuclear bomb in Israel and they attempt to do so, then Israel would retaliate. And you know, it's kind of that same idea you have in the Cold War, that mutual assured destruction idea, that, you know, don't do this because we will fight back. So anyways, you do have that as another card on the table starting in 1973. So you can imagine this war is pretty intense. It was a very difficult war, lots of blood, lots of deaths on both sides. And at one point, Israel was actually needing some help. They were running out of resources. And interestingly, Golda Meir, who was more of a socialist in many ways, went to her European neighbors who were socialist in many ways and said, hey, we need some help. We need supplies. We need some money. And they said, no, 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 no. We don't want to help you, right? And here's Europe again turning its back on the Jewish people. Who helped Israel? Nixon. And I say that way because if you know anything about Nixon, Richard Nixon was, of course, caught saying some pretty anti-Semitic things in his time in office, and not being, you know, the kindest person in terms of an individual towards, you know, his behavior and the way he talks and the way he says things. However, in a practical way, he was very pro-Israel. And it's kind of an interesting thing where as an individual, he wasn't very nice. But as a president, he helped Israel a lot through what is called Operation Nickel Grass, as you can see there. And this was an operation where the United States would fly tons and tons of supplies, either by sea or by air, right? I believe, I'll give you the exact number, 22,000 tons of supplies by air, and another 90,000 tons were delivered by sea. 567 missions. So all of that was Operation Nickel Grass. And when Golda Meir found out about this in a cabinet meeting, apparently she teared up because she knew how important this was to sustain Israel during this 1973 war. So this war went on, and, you know, in terms of land changing, nothing really happened. None of the land changed hands. It was just really bloody and brutal, and there we are in 1973, still in the status quo. So that's the 1973 war. So if nothing changed politically in terms of land or anything changing, what happens? Are there any impacts of the 1973 war? And there is. And probably the most significant impact of the 1973 war is what it's going to do to Sadat. The Sadat was the leader, of course, of Egypt, and things start to change mentally with him after the 73 war. So this is going to be pretty important. Let's talk about this. So this is the result. What you get is the start of the peace of Israel, Egypt, and as I already mentioned, Jordan. So Jordan had already kind of been open to making peace with Israel. But Jordan was important. Egypt was the key player. Egypt was the ultimate foe against Israel since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And one of the effects, I think, of the 73 war is that at least Egypt and Sadat said, you know what, it is what it is, guys. We're not going to destroy the State of Israel. They have nuclear bombs now. We're going to have to find a way to live with peace with them. And so it was the beginning of the peace talks that are eventually going to lead to a very famous, important peace treaty. But it all starts right after 1973. So we're going to talk about how this developed. So we get the buildup. So during the Nixon administration, there was a man named Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was the Secretary of State. And early in the 1970s, after 1974, 75, during this time period, 1973 really, you already had Kissinger kind of starting to have some talk and negotiations with Israel and Egypt. Hey, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And are we going to find a way to make some peace? It takes a few years, but eventually we get to 1977, 1978. By then, Menachem Begin, that's a very important person you hear, and it's pronounced Begin, not Begin, Menachem Begin. He was the prime minister of Israel, right? This is by 1977, 1978. Sadat was, again, still the ruler of Egypt. And Jimmy Carter was the president, of course, of the United States by then, right? And so Sadat in 1977, after some very quiet negotiations, went to the Knesset. The Knesset is Israel's parliament, if you don't know that term. Again, I want to make sure you know that term. All these key words as always, get them all down. And so he went to the Knesset in 1977, the Israeli parliament, and he gave a speech. And in this speech, he said, I will recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. That resonated dramatically. I mean, again, this is the leader of Egypt. It is the ultimate foe of Israel. And he is now saying, you know what? Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state. And that allowed now for this very big discussion into the Camp David talks in 1978. Camp David is, of course, a presidential retreat in the United States. And so in 1978, Carter, Menachem Begin, and Sadat met, and they hammered out an agreement. And they came to this very important agreement in which Egypt would receive the entire Sinai Peninsula back, right? So that was the big agreement. That entire area of the Sinai Peninsula would now return to Egypt. In exchange, Egypt would recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. So what you see in here is Israel has and was willing to give up land for peace. And Israel could say, well, we won this land in a war fair and square. Why should we give it back, right? I mean, how often, think about this in history, how often in history does a country fight a war, win the war handily, and then say, all right, here, we're going to give the land back. And all they wanted back for it is an exchange, Israel's right to exist. That's pretty stunning. And here's a twist that very few people know. After they made this agreement, you know what they discovered in the Sinai? Oil. They actually discovered oil in the Sinai after this. And Israel go, well, we discovered this oil. It's a great commodity at the time. And they still honored that agreement. And so Israel did pull out of the Sinai. This didn't happen overnight. This took a few stages. But they did pull out of Sinai. And to Egypt's credit, they did recognize Israel's right to exist. And this is a very famous photo at Camp David. And again, here you see the three key figures, Sadat, Jimmy Carter, and Menachem Begin. And, most people acknowledge, of course, it was Sadat who was the one who really was the one who made the biggest leap, right? He had to make the biggest leap of faith to make this happen. And he did. And you could see there's kind of this genuine happiness there. And so I think the 73 war, if you want to think of one positive impact, it did wake up Sadat. Of course, there will be some unfortunate aftermaths of this 1978 Camp David Accords that were signed. So let's talk about that. And this is the most unfortunate one. As a result of this agreement, Egypt was actually vilified by their Arab nations. They were excommunicated, essentially, of course, not a Muslim term, but excommunicated from the Islamic community. They were kicked out of Arab leagues. They were kicked out of conferences. Because how dare they make a peace treaty with the Jews? And so a lot of Arab nations were not happy about this. But probably the worst thing that had happened was Sadat was assassinated. And here you see this photo, and I'm going to try to find a quick little 2-minute video that I've used before in class of, a guy narrating the events leading up to the Sadat assassination. So Sadat was assassinated, and he was assassinated because he made peace with Israel. He was assassinated by radical Muslims inside of the area of the Arab world, Egypt, that simply did not want peace with Israel. It was that simple. The peace maintained, but because when Sadat was assassinated, a man named Mubarak takes over, and Mubarak honored the peace treaties. So, in fact, as much as they tried to break it, it didn't work. And the peace treaty with Egypt has continued, even when there was this kind of turmoil situation in Egypt in the 2015 period, roughly, right, where you had the Mubarak eventually falls, and you had that Arab Spring, as it was called. Egypt still does have a peace treaty with Israel, so that's at least one positive thing. But the sad story is Sadat was assassinated as a result of this. All right, so you definitely want to know about that. So here's just this last quick story of conflict that I want to mention. So yes, Israel had made peace with Egypt. They were also working with a lot of peace treaties with Jordan. Syria is not as well going as smoothly, but Iraq, right over here, was really a concern for Israel. Because by 1981, remember, Iraq had already been involved in a lot of these wars, and by 1981, Saddam Hussein was in power. This is the same Saddam Hussein is going to fight a big war with Iran, and he was developing nuclear bombs. And they had a whole nuclear facility in a place called Osirak that Israel found out about. And what Israel decided to do was, again, really one of the more remarkable operations called Operation Opera, as you can see up here. It's called Operation Opera, 1981. And what the Israeli Air Force did was decide that they cannot wait for Saddam Hussein to develop this nuclear capability weapon. So they took their jets and they flew them. And they flew them from Israel, as you can see here, all the way to Osirak and blew it up. And they go, what's the big deal? Well, guys, this is the big deal about this story. And anybody who knows any military history, if you're like into big military history, this is a very famous military event. Because to do this, you have to fly, as you can see, across Saudi Arabia into Iraq airspace. Obviously, these countries are not going to let Israel do this. And Israel has to do this quietly. They have to do this without being noticed. And how do you fly a plane that far? This is a good couple hundred miles, I believe. How do you fly a plane that far, undetected? Well, you fly very, 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 very low to the ground, literally 100 feet above the ground. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever seen like an air show. And if you see the air shows and they're flying, and even there, the jets are flying above you. They're more than 100 feet above the ground, and you can kind of imagine what that feels like. And why do you fly that low? You fly that low because then you avoid radar. And they actually managed to do this. But flying 100 feet above the ground for that long of a distance, I mean, that's pretty intense flying. And apparently from an Air Force perspective, this is seen as one of the most remarkable air operations. And it worked. They blew it up. They came back. Of course, afterwards, everyone was like, how dare you do this, Israel? How dare you go into another country and blow it up? And then, of course, later on in history, when Iraq invades Kuwait and all of that we had talked about, people are like, well, boy, we're glad Israel blew up Iraq's nuclear facility back in 1981. So you have that going on. So anyway, so that's the Osirak story. If you're not familiar with it, it's another one of those interesting conflicts. So here we are, 1980s. What's next? Well, by now, again, these Arab nations, I think, have come to a realization that Israel's not going anywhere. And the focus in the 1980s is no longer about, Iraq or Syria or Egypt or Saudi Arabia launching a massive attack to destroy Israel. I think they realize that's not going to happen. I think they also know Israel has nuclear bombs, and that option is kind of off the table. And by the way, look at us in Israel on this map, how small it is when you add up all the Arab nations together. That gives you a little bit of perspective too. But what does happen in the 1980s and to kind of the 1990s, 2000s is the unresolved issue. And the big unresolved issue that Israel has to deal with is what about all those Arabs, the Palestinians, still living inside of Israel now? Since the 1967 war, the Arabs living in the West Bank, the Arabs living in Gaza primarily. What's going on with the Palestinians? And we need to talk about that because that's an important part of this puzzle as well. How is that dealt with? How are they going to find some way to live together? Do they find ways to live together? What is the end game? Do the Palestinians simply want peace with Israel? Do the Palestinians want to destroy Israel? And kind of the back and forth with all that. And that's something we're gonna cover in our next lecture. So hopefully you found all these battles, these wars interesting, intense, pretty important. If you have any questions about them, please let me know. Thank you.